In the last 2 days, I've heard a number of comments about health and health critical infrastructure. In fact, yesterday during the exercise, it came up quite frequently. That warms my heart. We would like to be higher on the priority list and know that it is, in fact, an essential function, an emergency support function 8, that we in health and medical have. Last year, I had the good fortune to be able to present on a subject of public health consequences of a cyber event, which included EMP and solar storms. And this year, they invited us back to explore the topic of health and some of these major threats a little further. The thing I'm particularly appreciate is that these subject matter experts who are here with me today have a broad grasp of the threat, but also the technology and some of the solutions. And that's sort of the guidance I gave to my panel, which is that we've discussed threat a lot, and we have a pretty good grasp of some of the physical consequences of these phenomena. But what I wanted to ask our panel to focus on today also is some solutions, both technological and others. So that's what we're going to do today. We'll hit on some particular threats to health infrastructure and then focus on solutions. So the panel, in short, let me go ahead and make some introductions here. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Terry Donahue, and Terry has done a lot of things. He's based out of Chicago, but he particularly is going to talk today about communications, and we all know in whatever disaster we're responding to, communications is number 1, 2, and 3. So health critical communications. Dr. Don Donahue I've known for a long time. He's done many things in his career, but he's a consultant to the American Academy of Disaster Medicine, and also involved in many private sector government consulting. Ms. Sierra Bainbridge, Chuck had indicated we were hoping that she was here. I spoke with her just yesterday, and she may have gotten tied up. There's a lot going on in town right now, so we may yet get to see her. If not, Chuck has promised to sort of fill in on their encounters in Africa when he was over there. And Sierra's topic is off-grid hospitals, And then my good friend, Captain, U.S. Navy Captain Art Glynn, who has a unique perspective, straddling both the private sector and his work with Booz Allen Hamilton, and also as a Navy Emergency Preparedness Liaison Officer at United States Northern Command. Quite a Colorado contingent at this conference. Can I see hands of people who are from Colorado? There we go. Well, there's a few. Yeah, okay. Great, and appreciate what you do there in Denver. Okay, well, my comments are going to be brief, and let's just say that with increasing complexity comes increasing vulnerability. Now, some of the solutions to our collective problem may, in fact, be advanced technology, but in the medical realm, it's easy to imagine that over the last 30 years or so, that the way that we practice medicine is different, and that we're increasingly reliant upon sophisticated technology. And I have the good fortune of teaching medical students, and so I'm finding that in many cases, we're losing some of our practitioner diagnostic skills, again, in favor of scanners and other types of technical equipment. Add to that the electronic medical record. You may remember from the news quite recently that in Dallas, the first Ebola patient to die in the United States, there was a little bit of confusion about notes made on an electronic medical record in the emergency room. And old school or old style, where we had a paper record, that might have not been overlooked. By contrast, in Denver, a little over a year ago, there was a mass shooting, unfortunately, and the University of Colorado Medical School, and not too far from there, received the majority of the patients. And they had at the ready paper charts, gurneys, and of course they had practiced doing things, again, sort of old school. So one of the appeals, one of the solutions, one of the possible solutions that I would like to offer in the healthcare sector might not be more technology, but less, sort of a return back to the future, and that we would then hone a lot of the skills that we learned perhaps when we were early in our careers and practice those without benefit of a lot of the sophisticated equipment we use in hospitals. Recently, with Hurricane Sandy, with Superstorm Sandy, one of the major hospitals, New York University Hospital, was without electricity for, well, almost 30 days. They had gotten over the generator in the basement thing, but in turn, some of the switch boxes and other apparatus were flooded when the storm came through. Because there were other hospitals in the area, the patients were transferred out, and there was no loss of life that I know of from that particular hospital evacuation, which, by the way, is a really tough thing to do. But if it was a widespread disaster, we wouldn't have other hospitals in the immediate area with the sort of the catcher's mitt on, and hospitals would have to stay and play, if you would. They will have to continue their operations, which, again, is another theme of this panel. Again, on the positive side, I would like to mention that there are some policy changes in the works as a result of Superstorm Sandy, and specifically with regards increasing disaster preparedness. And this particular document, which is a draft, I know is being actively worked on. We talked with one of the authors this week, and it has to do with 17 different categories of healthcare facilities that will be required to make changes to their policies and procedures regards disasters, and specifically disasters in the light of lessons learned from Superstorm Sandy. So their hook, if you will, is that they're going to tie Medicare and Medicaid payments to these changes. I would suggest also, and this is a good time to do it, that this new legislation, SIPA, which would include the EMP scenario, hospitals and clinics and emergency management personnel, of course, train all the time, that they now additionally train to an EMP scenario. So this might be something, if we're lucky and timely, we can get instituted into this rulemaking. The only other piece that I would add to our policy discussion are personnel changes. You know, in most business, it's the people that matter. It's not the things so much. And particularly in the hospital business, we've looked at this. And in a particularly stressful scenario, such as a pandemic, there may be as much as 60% absenteeism of medical personnel. To include people who stay home to take care of their own families. You may think about your own business sector and may come up with similar numbers, but these are your first responders in the hospitals. So we need to do things better on a personnel policy basis to encourage people and allow them to be able to come in and do their job and do their job for you, which may include such things as helping to protect their families. So in an EMP scenario, it may mean that healthcare facilities need to also not only make their hospital facility more resilient, but allow the family members of staff to be able to come in and get help as well. So I think I'm not going to touch on some of the other things there, but I'd like to go to our first speaker, Terry, if we could get his presentation up, his slides. Yeah, you do. That's one of the three. Okay. Well, you know what? Dr. Donat, I know, is a very resourceful guy, so he may start his presentation a cappella, and if we could get the slides up as soon as we can. You want one of the other panel members to go first? Okay, Don, can you go? Are you Sierra?
My slides.
Welcome, Sierra.
Thank you so much.
We're definitely doing this one on the fly. That's because we're resilient.
We're resilient, yes. Continue. If you see slide 1, it says, and I'm actually going to expand on a lot of stuff that Dr. Terbush just talked about, that increasingly our hospitals are wired. The trend in healthcare right now is to move away from hospital care. Care is moving out of the hospital, it's moving into the community, into the ambulatory care world. But when the push comes to shove, when I'm really sick or something, everything starts, breaking down, we go to the hospital. So if you look at the modern hospital, unlike the example in Rwanda, our diagnostics, your X-ray machine, your MRI, your lab, all is highly automated. Your climate control is important. It not only keeps the air hot or warm, but as alluded to, it's your infection control mechanism. Big issue with Ebola and MERS and some of the other communicable diseases that have shown up. All your mechanical, your doors, your access to your pharmacy, your elevators. If you can't get between floors, you can't push that gurney up and down to the OR. And then electronic health record. Not only are electronic health records becoming prominent, as a nation we've legislated that. If you're not using electronic health records in a meaningful use, you will be penalized in the future. So all of that is pushing us to a highly automated system. I had great it's a great visual. I called it lessons earned. In 2005, hospitals in New Orleans were flooded. There was one hospital in particular, Methodist Memorial, that they were smart. They said, we'll put the generator on the roof. Out of all the hospitals in those 3 parishes, they got it. Unfortunately, their fuel pod was out on the edge of the property. So they went down and they flooded. And so, the visual here is lessons earned. So in 2005, we flooded a hospital, and guess what? In 2012, we flooded hospitals in New York City again. As a culture, we're really slow to pick up. It's sad. So absent hardening, have a great picture here at Godzilla. Unless we harden, do all the things that you've been hearing about for the last 2 days, the modern hospital will not function following an EMP or CME or even a really big lightning strike, an approximate lightning strike. Our modern hospital will be offline. But the problem isn't necessarily what you think it is. Oops, flipped one too many pages. I have a picture. I had an aerial shot of a major medical center in the Northeast that I won't identify, and their power went out. Power went out, and all their backup systems, generators kicked in, and they were tooling along just fine. Then, at the edge of this major campus, there was this little concrete block building that just sort of innocuously sat out there. Well, it turns out that the little concrete block building was the pump house for the sewage system. If you've ever lived in a house with a septic tank and it gets full, you know what happens. Well, the hospital, starting on, I think, the 5th floor, trickling on down, this major medical center had a huge problem. Nobody planned for that. The OR ran, the ER ran, nothing would flush. So your problem isn't necessarily the thing you think it's going to be. So the way ahead is, we've talked about, the way ahead is one, and I'm probably preaching to the choir. The health system, you need to do a comprehensive vulnerability and risk assessment, but really comprehensive, looking beyond the normal things. We have a strong tendency to say, oh, we're in charge. I run disaster drills. We know what's happening. Look at your internal systems. Look at your external systems. Where's the fuel for your generators going to come from? One of my pet peeves, where's your oxygen going to come from? I'll bet you in every town that every one of you is from, there's 1, maybe 2 O2 companies. So if every hospital in your state needs an extra load of oxygen, where's it coming from? That's an unanswered question. And then start to develop, Dr. Terbush, you need to start to develop viable alternatives for staffing, for access to the hospital, to the facilities, your outlying clinics, modified standards of care. The standard of care for being on a ventilator is 100% oxygen. What do you do when you're running out of oxygen? And we train our physicians and our nurses and our medical staff so well to quality of care. When it's time to alter, to work outside of that parameter, they have a hard time with it. They really have, even in the face of disaster, they have a hard time adjusting. So you have to work on that, and you have to train them for the unexpected. And then you have to plan for working around. Healthcare, probably more than anything, uses just-in-time supply processes. You know, in a major blackout, there's not going to be any time for the just-in-time. A couple other slides talking about consider capital investments. I actually had the privilege of sitting in on a briefing for a company that does construction, and one of their main lines is retrofitting and making hospitals, taking them off the grid, which leads into your presentation. Taking them off the grid, making them self-generating their own heating and air conditioning, and there's actually incentives and there's a business case that saves the facility money. It's a capital investment, but in the long run, it saves you money and it gives you resiliency. My bullet list here: harden your electrical systems. You know, I was having a talk last night with a colleague in Tampa, and I said to her, you know what? In your house, is your television, your stereo, your microwave, are they all on surge protectors? And I started thinking about my own house and said, you know, so there are simple answers that we just fail to follow. Plan to be able to operate for extended time off the grid. Anticipate your external pinch points. Expect an increased patient load. When things go bad, people start doing stupid things. People start running generators inside houses, heating their house with charcoal, you know, getting puncture wounds. So when things go bad, more people are going to come to the hospital, not fewer. Understand and train for the modified standards of care. Try to be self-sufficient. In all likelihood, help isn't coming. You're going to be working on your own. And expect the unexpected. You know, I have a note here for yourself to consider Joplin. Nobody that I know of predicted a 2-mile wide tornado that would knock a 6-story hospital off its foundation. You know, we never planned for that. Plan for the unexpected. It's coming. I have a slide that it's not a matter of if. You know, you've been hearing that all day. And I had another great slide that I stole from one of the speakers last year. There's a picture here of a stone in Japan, and I don't know, very old, and on a stone, in Japanese, of course, it says, "High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Did not build any homes below this point." They didn't follow their own advice. We tend not to follow our own advice. So we need to look at the situation and think of the unthinkable.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Okay, and I'm very pleased to introduce Sierra Bainbridge. We've spoken over the phone only before, but I was so excited about the products from Mass Design Group out of Boston and what they'd been doing in Africa. So, Sierra, I'd like to invite you to go ahead and tell us about off-grid hospitals.
Sure. Hi. My apologies to the panel for being late. I'm so happy to be here with you all. And also, hopefully, to learn as much as possible. And I apologize as well. My slides also are somewhere in the ether and have not landed. Which is unfortunate because, of course, I'm an architect, and a lot of the things that I was hoping to show you were images of some of the work that we've done, which is kind of fun to break up the information that's passing. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk a little bit about our work. As mentioned, we work mostly in Africa, also in Haiti, and we're just starting to work in the United States a bit. And our goal is really to think about how we can take the lessons that we have learned in those places and bring them to bear on the work that we hope to do here. And especially in light of, you know, some of the issues that we have been having in terms of major disasters that really cause us to be in peril of lack of care during those times. So, and many of the ones that have just been mentioned, I think, are the examples also that we're looking at, and especially Hurricane Sandy. Our office is based in Boston, and so we are thinking a lot about the storms that are bound to hit in our area in the near future. So learning, we think of it a little bit of south to north learning, and what are the things that we can take from the work that we've done. Specifically, we're working in a place that has very little guidelines. A lot of the countries that we're working do not yet have healthcare building standards and codes, and in fact, we're working on writing some of those for countries like Liberia. Unfortunately, it only finished in last December, so they were not able to begin implementing that ahead of Ebola, and also the same for Rwanda. In this case, it actually frees us up to really try to do things that might not fit in, and I think that's one of the limitations we have here in the United States is obviously we have huge amount of code and infrastructure that are to create the safest environment possible, but often that ends up limiting us and creating some paralysis in our ability to maybe do the best thing possible in our current moment, and it takes a little bit of time to kind of dismantle those or loosen those up so that we can provide the right kind of solutions. We are dealing with a lot of other limitations, very, very low budget on all of our projects. We're looking at very limited resources, and for Rwanda, for example, importing, there is no local steel or cement availability, so we import a lot of that, which means very high costs for those items, so we're always constantly looking for what can we use locally, and I mean, that applies everywhere. But I think, most pertinent to this discussion is we're looking at places that don't have a reliable grid. So the electricity continually goes off multiple times a day or consistently at a certain time each day, or it'll kind of move around the particular city. Some places are on and some are off, and part of that is in Rwanda, all of their electricity at the moment is brought in on a truck through diesel fuel to one central location, and then it's kind of pumped out to the rest of the country. They are looking at methane gas as an alternative, but until then it's extremely expensive, and so they kind of have to ration it out. And so the result is that we're looking at ways of building hospitals that can function still when there is no electricity and on the kind of very least level of resources possible. And we're still having, a lot of these diagnostic equipment and other things, but to kind of state the most obvious steps that we've taken, starting with Butaro Hospital, which we started in 2009. That's when I moved to Rwanda to work on that project, and finished a couple of years later in 2011. And this is where I would be showing you the great images of this beautiful hospital in it's really one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Rwanda is called the land of 1,000 hills, and it's extremely green. And this is really sitting atop of one of these hills. And so we were able to take advantage of some very simple design moves in order to increase the resilience of this hospital. So one is natural lighting and ventilation. We still worked with all of the guidelines from WHO, and we worked closely with doctors from the Harvard School of Public Health who are really focusing on infectious disease control, especially around the areas of TB. And we went back and forth with them throughout the entire design process to really make sure that we were covering our bases and creating a redundant system by which, if the electricity is out, we still have a way to get minimum 10 to 12 air changes per hour, so we can really make sure that we're continuing to keep infection control measures going. So we took a few main moves. Another bit of context. I'll wrap up as soon as
No.
I have a couple of other examples.
You're good at doing word pictures, so go
Okay.
ahead.
TB is a huge issue in Rwanda, and or not in Rwanda, but in sub-Saharan Africa. And TB specifically is an airborne disease, and so the air changes per hour really have an impact. And people are, in fact, going to hospitals, catching things like MDR TB, which is multi-drug resistant TB, and dying from actually going to the hospital without TB, catching it while they're there, being treated for something else, and then dying from that. So it's a real threat, and so this was the focus of the design behind this. And so we did some very simple things. Because the climate was quite temperate, or tropical temperate, meaning it's about 70 degrees every day, we moved all of our pathways, rather than having hallways on the interior of the building where people often wait, and that's where diseases are transmitted on the waiting areas. All of those were moved to the exterior, so we have no interior passageways. All patient waiting is also on the exterior, and we created a beautiful landscape to still make these places really palatable and really comfortable and very dignified, but reduce that potential for transmission. In terms of the air changes per hour in each of the rooms, we worked really hard to have excellent cross ventilation for our primary method of moving air through, and we rely on that for our multiple air changes per hour. And then in addition, we have, and this should be running all the time when we have electricity, we have huge 2-meter wide fans. We've got the hospital, excellent. We can skip through quite a bit. This is some of the introduction. Yeah, very good. So this is Butaro, and keep going just a little bit. I don't know if it can be taken over here. Yeah. A little context. I don't know where to aim it. So this is the kind of context we're talking about, again, really sitting on top of a mountain in Rwanda. Sorry, really sitting on top of a mountain in Rwanda. Here you can see all the pathways, as I mentioned, have been moved to the exterior of the building but are still covered, so you can move between every treatment area undercover, but on the exterior. And again, creating these large, expansive landscape areas for people to wait. The question is, how can we create these redundant systems? And so this, I'm catching up now. It's still coming in, I think. Point it in the right direction. There we go. Oh, this way. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So this is, just as I was speaking about, we have operable windows here, fixed open louvers, which is creating our cross ventilation. And then most of the time when we do have electricity, we have these very large diameter fans that were actually donated by Big Ass Fans, this amazing fan company, and UVGI fixtures. So this brings the air up into this zone, this plenum of air, and it's treated there by the UVGI fixtures. However, when it is off, we still have 12 air changes per hour. So these are really simple methods of having systems that still allow us to have infection control, even in the case when we don't have electricity. And this is just a section showing the same information. And we've tried to use this same work on our other work that we've been doing in Rwanda and in the area. This is a huge maternal services expansion for a hospital that had a very building from about 1810 or 1910, which was in very poor repair. And we've used these large chimneys here for the same purpose. It's an urban area, so unlike being on top of a hill, we couldn't rely completely on natural cross ventilation at the ground level. And so by lifting this chimney up, and using convection, which I keep pointing the wrong way to flick the slides. Okay, one back one, there we go. We're using this dark stone and this roof that's painted black to really pull the air up and out of the room. So we're still managing to get those air changes per hour, even though we're in an urban area and don't necessarily have a breeze at all times. And so these are the kinds of very simple systems that we're trying to implement on each of the hospitals. This is a large hospital, again in an urban area in Haiti. This is a competition, but it still speaks to the concepts that we're talking about. Specifically, here we were looking at, on the lower levels, where you have a very wide slab, we would put all the technical services down there, where at the top of the building, where you have a much narrower slab, that's where you would have wards, so you can still have cross-ventilation, where patients are spending the majority of their time. And along the back of the building, and in all of our projects, we always try to have ramping. Even on a building, this one is multi-story, most of ours are 1 to 2 stories, so that even in the case of an electrical failure, you can still manage to get people from floor to floor as needed. So this allows for gurneys, and in the case that your elevators are not working, you're still able to function as a hospital. So there's a third system, there's natural ventilation. And then obviously we're trying to keep on all of these buildings as much light in all of the spaces as possible, so we can rely on natural lighting. And then this is just some diagramming of the same information. And I'll just talk about this one last one and then I'll be finished. This is a cholera treatment center. It's also a diarrheal disease treatment center, which is still the leading cause of children in most countries in the world, and certainly in Haiti. The big issue in Haiti during the kind of massive cholera outbreak that you heard about a few years ago is that there is no central sanitation system. And in addition to that, when people were creating kind of temporary hospitals to treat cholera, you're having to then move the waste, which is highly contaminated and what initially caused the outbreak, to another area for treatment. And a lot of times they were finding that this movement to the proper treatment area was not happening. And so you're having further contamination of other areas where it was just being dumped in a totally, off of the road side of place and causing additional problems. So the thought here was, in addition to creating a building that isn't a tent, that functions, that when you put that investment in, you don't have to replace it every 6 months to a year, which is typical for temporary emergency efforts. This one would last and could change program if needed, but would have, most importantly, its own on-site water treatment facility. And this would treat it down to 99.95% of cholera. So there really is nothing escaping. And the other reason we had to do this is because this particular location is at the water table. So there was no way to have anything filter down and be cleaned through that filtration system as you would have on a normal site. And so we worked with a civil engineering group in California to really create a system that collects all the water off of these roofs to supply a huge amount of water demand that you would have for constant cleaning of cholera waste, pails, buckets, chairs, everything. And then all of that waste water would be treated on site before it's released. So very quickly, just to kind of give some examples, and obviously the very last one that I had, you can tell me whether I should go on or quit.
Let's save this
Okay,
for right at the end. And let's see, Art, would you like to go next? Here we go. Navy Captain Art Glynn, who's specialty at this point are energy resilient hospitals. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Again, I'm Art Glynn, and first of all, let me say thank you. One of the things that I find that oftentimes my colleagues say, Art, you're way out there, you're thinking out of the box. I find a very friendly audience here, because the issues that I raise amongst my colleagues, every person I've engaged with here has a similar thought process. You folks get it. The bottom line that we have is we are all in this together. Today I'm representing the Department of Defense, and sometimes DOD and NORTHCOM specifically is an enigma. We're the cavalry, supposedly. Folks, we're all in this together. DOD, as much capability as we have, will not be able to solve all the problems. Now, as Jim mentioned, I also serve as what we call a NEPLO, a Navy Emergency Preparedness Liaison Officer. Primary responsibility is working closely with FEMA and frankly, to be the last in and first out. There's no question that DOD is very, very expensive. We do have a lot of capability. It's a long time for need. So if we get advance warning, we can be there. We'll come in force, but it will take some time. So working in concert with FEMA, Craig Fugate is a FEMA administrator who's endured a great deal, and he has done an exceptional job, certainly in my opinion. What I like about Craig is his focus from the get-go was the first 72 hours, communities, individuals, families. It's up to you. It's up to you. Individual, family, community resiliency. If you can't achieve it, you can't be resilient beyond that, that's when you ask for help. Secondly, this whole idea about victimization basically said stop. We have survivors, we have victims or casualties. It's a nuance in our world today. And fortunately, everybody I see here, survivors. And if the day does happen, we'll be survivors. Also talk about, as far as energy resilience, working at NORTHCOM in another capacity with a program or project called SPIDERS, Smart Power Infrastructure Demonstration for Energy Reliability and Security. We say SPIDERS an awful lot. Let me just boil it down to its bare essence. It's a cyber-secure smart grid, so microgrid. We are now entering phase 3, which is to what we call islanding of Camp Smith. So being able to provide resilient energy for Camp Smith, which houses PACOM and MAR 4-pack, obviously is a crucial element for any adversaries we might have in the Pacific, whether it's North Korea or China. And let me also share with you that we've talked a lot about EMP, and certainly that would be a very, very bad day. We've also talked about cyber. And I will offer to you that we have been at war, the cyber domain, for a number of years. Now, I know a lot of people will bristle, certainly wearing the uniform. Hey, Art, you can't say we're at war. The reality, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, looks like a duck, it probably is. Fortunately, what's starting to happen, a lot of what we see behind the proverbial green door, classified, that I'd love to share, but obviously I don't want to go to jail. But a lot of the information is becoming to the forefront as far as the various cyber attacks we see, or we see power outages. And power outages, make comment for the folks who were participating yesterday, the question that I asked is the various cyber threats we see, the vast majority, nearly 60% of them, have been targeted against the energy sector, primarily the electric grid. We've talked about what is the day after, 1 second after, if you will. It doesn't really matter how it happens. The response is going to be very, very similar. The only difference if we had an EMP, obviously wearing the uniform, number one responsibility is Homeland Defense. So oftentimes, NORTHCOM, let me segue a little bit. NORTHCOM has 3 missions. Number 1 mission is Homeland Defense. Secondary mission is theater security cooperation. And the 3rd mission is defense support of civil authorities. If we are attacked, number 1 mission is Homeland Defense. So there's a perspective, certainly from a planning standpoint, that DoD is going to bring all this capability to the fight toward the response. That may not be a reality. But the one thing that DoD does very, very well is plan. I mean, we do it in our sleep, sometimes too much, particularly when it comes to crisis action planning. I know in my own family, my wife says, Art, you think too much. Well, it's better than not thinking at all. But I think that's what the group that we have here today, and it was yesterday, is you are all part of the solution. You're thinkers. And it is a whole of community type of solution. One of the things that I've thought about yesterday and what we've seen today, one takeaway that I want you to have, and I've said it several times, is we are all in this together. And we have a choice. We can be victims, or we can be survivors for our families, our communities, and most importantly, for our nation. Thank you.
Well done. Were we able to get some slides for Terry, for Dr. Donat? Got a thumbs up. IT, all right. Resilient IT. Terry, you're up.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for asking me to come here and speak, and it's a pleasure to serve on this panel with everyone here. I feel guilty because I actually am using the widest bandwidth, even though everyone else did a really good job in working without that. In looking at communication resilience, I look at the problem as, if you look at looking for what is a resilience model, I look at the human brain as probably the most resilient tool or biological formation I can think of that works. It's worked for us for 200,000 years. It provides us capabilities. It has certainly some problems, but while we're still trying to map it out, and that's what these are maps of where the main circuits that we're looking at in the brain as to how it works. It's at the gross level, not at the micro level yet. We certainly have some capabilities and characteristics of how the human brain works and spans communication between two people that we can look at and try and repeat in our disaster modeling when we don't have the full bandwidth and the full amount of energy we'd like to use. Quickly, I'm both a surgeon and a radio officer for the state, and in both voice and digital communications. And the reason I did that is I think healthcare is going to fail, not because medical personnel are going to leave the scene and flee away. It can fail certainly because you don't have supply lines that are satisfied. We certainly have a saline shortage in the U.S. right now, but I think it's probably going to fail worse because of coordination and collaboration through lack of communications. My best example I spoke to Mary Lasky about over lunch was, if you have triage across a state or a region, and in one place triage means you get dialysis, and another place it doesn't, it's not the fact that you're triaging, it's the fact that you're doing it unfairly is going to lead to a lot of disruption, social problems, and also allocation of resources will be a problem. So when we look at what are the resilience characteristics that the brain has that we're trying to repeat in communication, one of the things that we have to look at is, just like your brain, we have in communications, a person with a transceiver, meaning you can both send and receive signals, has a producer to consumer ratio of 1 to 1. Now, in search and rescue, people who are looking for the person who may have a radio are many people trying to talk to one, or the person who's trying to be rescued is one to many, but at least you have a one-to-one. And if everyone had the ability to produce energy, produce food, produce water, produce health care, we wouldn't even have this conference or the need for it. But in a resource-limited environment, you have a problem where you have to have resources, and certainly for radio, especially the amateur community, you have pre-distributed information, or pre-distributed facilities and training. It's familiar. It's language agnostic, meaning it doesn't really matter what language you use, especially if it's digital. And it's portable use for responders, their families, and the public. And if you think that you're going to be able to go and work for weeks or months without talking to your family as well as doing your job, good luck with that. Certainly we have redundant integration over paths. Certainly the digital pathways that are currently used are in maritime, certainly air and terrestrial and space. And through time, asynchronous communications, store and forward messaging, that's allowed through digital communications. Self-regulating and self-healing. Certainly self-regulating in the sense that people want to communicate, and therefore the effort will be to continue that communication even when you have barriers that you might meet. The other thing, self-healing, if there's interference or if there's someone who, because of the nature that they have to sleep, can't continue on for 24 hours, you have someone else who can step in with that equipment. It's adaptive through inherent diversity and advantageous change, meaning, inherently, we are all here with different databases in our head. We look at the communication rate. Without having any other background or slides, we were communicating. We speak at about 150 to 200 words a minute. We read at about 300 to 400 words a minute, and we think at about 600 words a minute. Do we need bandwidth in the megabytes per second in order to be able to communicate effectively? I would say, if you really believe that, then I'm not quite sure what you were doing here. And how much information you were actually getting all day, because you were communicating at a far lower rate and getting very effective information from all those people that have been presenting today. The prioritized capabilities based upon energy availability. We live in a society where we can go to McDonald's and have lots of food, or you can live someplace where you have very meager energy requirements, and our activities and our communication through the brain get prioritized, and the same thing is occurring by radio, where we can use 12-volt batteries or other sources that are very low voltage to be able to communicate over large areas. Potential for emergent properties, where the sum of the parts is greater than what you have individually. You may not be able to access databases across large areas, but if in each message, at the end of the message, you include the weather conditions at your local station, someone can propagate that, or can accumulate that and have some forecasting ability over time. And then the fact that it's active infrastructure independent or compatible for hybrid use. And the current data sessions that are out there using Netlink or WinLink 2000, what's happened, it's set up so that it will automatically choose to use the internet if it's available, or choose not to and go by radio directly in the case that it's not. One other thing I just wanted to mention, the structure on the left here, that's a connected gram of all the major pathways in the brain. Red being the most connected and blue and violet being the least connected. And while you would think that the brain is highly directly connected, it's actually not. It's mid-range, and that allows for the most adaptable connections between the 100 billion neurons and the 100 trillion connections that are estimated. Just some quick advantages of digital radio. Situational awareness, both internal and external. Hospitals are not small. Anyone who's walked in a hospital, you realize you can't communicate through those walls across many floors if you don't have communications. And hospitals are in general radio poor right now. They rely heavily upon the infrastructure, and that's one thing that probably will have to change to some degree. We are accused in medicine of using fancy and unfamiliar words. And when you start having lists of patients, pharmaceutical terms, medical terms, logistical supplies, even photographs of victims, spreadsheets, checklists, financial records, and personal assignments over many times, you're going to have to be able to transmit these very effectively. 100% accuracy for messaging. When people say, how can that be? In voice, we certainly make mistakes. I'm making some now. Maybe you know, maybe you don't. But the point being that with digital transmission, you have something called a checksum, where if the sender and the receiving station don't match up in the sum of the characters that are there, it automatically checks itself and resends it. You're able to provide both local and long-haul communications, and you're able to encrypt messages, because most of the system through WinLink is actually an email server, so you can actually encrypt both your messages and your attachments, which is important. Say, for instance, you want to have transportation of strategic national stockpile materials. You don't necessarily want to broadcast where those things are going. Reliable operation on low power levels and excellent portability. Hastily formed networks came out of the Naval Postgraduate School during Katrina. These networks were satellite-based, where they got the internet and beamed it down to 802.16 wireless wide-range areas in the city of New Orleans, and then locally at 802.11. And this provided broadband coverage. And this has been aggregated in the Banda Aceh, Katrina, Rita, and several other locations through the Naval Postgraduate School. And just to sort of short on time, I think the Naval Postgraduate School site is a great place to go and learn more about these. And that's just the setup. WinLink 2000 I mentioned. This is essentially with a radio, a computer which has a sound card, and a modem. You're able to either go directly radio to what's called radio messaging servers, which are located around the country, and then through the internet, there's common message servers around the world. And this is what Mars and RACES and also the private sector can use in WinLink to be able to send messages throughout the world on low power. I won't go through all the advantages of the digital communications. Much of them I mentioned before, but I just refer you to WinLink 2000. I think the biggest thing is you can send large amounts of data. You know, you can, for maybe $1,000 or $2,000, send tens of thousands of words per minute. So anything that would possibly exceed the data that you could possibly take care of or interpret in the time that you need. And then the accuracy is important. And lastly, there are besides the private sector and besides amateur radio, you certainly have the two big programs, which are Mars and RACES. RACES is under the emergency management of either your town or your state. Mars is run by a joint private-public partnership between the military, all three branches. And I think one of the parts of resilience is to make sure that when we have programs in place to support those and try and continue them, Navy Marine Mars right now is sort of chiefless, and I think anything we can do if there's anyone here to help support and get that program up and continued running, because it does involve assets in the hundreds of thousands of dollars around the country that are provided primarily by the private sector. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Terry. I've got to tell you, the panel exceeded all my expectations, and my expectations were very high indeed. Not only that, but they overcame in difficult circumstances. So thank you again to the panel. Chuck tells me we will be able to see the slides at some, okay, so there'll be a publication that will come out. You'll see all the slides. Do we have time for questions?
Let's do one question as the commissioner's coming forward.
Okay. Yes, please. We have a mic there for you.
Identify yourself, please.
My name is Yvette Gannon. Here through the New Haven FBI, Infragar, and the Connecticut and National. I'm very privileged to be here. We always use, so my question is for Sierra. I work as a bacteriologist and also a microbial forensic scientist. So I know you discuss about how you create a hospital, I think the physical structure to be more easygoing without electricity. But I am more interested about how in that kind of hospital they were having equipment to identify infectious disease without electricity. I don't know if you could give me some ideas what they were using, because I work for the Greenwich Health Department laboratory, and we are trying to find equipment because we're thinking about if the electricity is not working, but at this point we haven't found much equipment that we could use to serve the citizens, the general population. Thank you.
No, I mean, the short answer is that... Sorry, the short answer is that I, working on the architectural side, don't know as much about the identification of what you're talking about. We have backup generators, and that's what we relied on for the most part for some of the higher tech things, especially some of the TB equipment. And they tend to use, for most other things, very, very low tech, unless it's these like XDR-TB, MDR-TB identification systems. I can't remember the name of that exact machine, but those, we also haven't found any of those that haven't had that. So in places that we've worked with PIH, like Lesotho, where they actually have to kind of fly these samples from places with no electricity into cities and labs that are higher, have a higher accessibility to the grid. And those are the only things that I've seen so far, but you might have.
The technology that Sierra mentions is eminently adaptable here in the United States, and in fact, in many cases, we do use it. But it's possible to go ahead and culture bacteria. There are rapid diagnostic tests and other low energy consumption types of diagnostic tests to do what you suggest. I just want to finish with, though, a quote from Dr. Paul Farmer, who is sort of the patron saint of international humanitarian assistance, and I just found out that Sarah and her group are working directly for Dr. Farmer. Dr. Farmer, a long history in Haiti. One of his famous quotes was that, why is it that the poor always get the worst? And I think we can see from some of the technology that Sierra's talked about, some of the innovations from Terry and Don, and then of course our motivator here on the end from NORTHCOM, Art Glynn. I think you can see that even in very difficult circumstances, we continue to provide good care at a very high standard. Thank you.